Amber. Thanks, Amber. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Really excited to be here with all of you and kicking off this year's set of trainings in partnership with Cornell and Best Buddies. I'm Kim Osmani, and I'm a Senior Extension Associate here at Cornell University, but I'm based in my home office in Norman, Oklahoma, from Miami, Florida originally, so love to hear the shout out for the folks from Florida. We're really excited that we get to kick this off with Jeffrey as the trainer for the first training for this year. And for those of you who've been a part of this partnership for a couple of years, you might notice just a little bit of a difference in kind of the structure that we have for this year, where we're going to be offering 2-hour trainings over the course of the year. So we have it, the next one will be in May, and I believe we've got August and November. We're also hoping to join all of you for at least a day, kind of coinciding with your leadership conference, to do some activities there as well. And then, as Alex mentioned, we're hosting those virtual office hours, which really are not a formal structured time where we're going to be actually presenting a training, but the office hours are more exactly like what he said about if you have questions, if you have scenarios, challenges, experiences that you guys are having on the job, and you want to come and bend our ear and just get some technical assistance and consulting that way through those virtual office hours, you can pop in and pop out as you see fit, according to your schedule and according if you have a need. We are toying around with the idea of that, like we do the training that Jeffrey's leading today on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that you might have some questions that pertain specifically to this training that you want to talk about in those office hours. So it's really a flexible time. We want you to just feel welcome to come in and ask the questions and just engage in conversation with us. So really excited to be here with all of you. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeffrey. So thanks all for being here.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I love all the positive energy and love going around here in the chat box. Really feels great. It's what I love about your organization. I was telling folks I happened to stumble across in my drawer, I hadn't seen it in a while, my Best Buddies sweatshirt, and figured it was apropos that I wear it today.
I want that sweatshirt.
What's that? So today's topic we are calling and some of you who've known me a while, I've been working with all of you since at least 2018, 19. So, I've been around a while, and I've talked about this topic, the ADA, as well as many others. So I'm calling it Key Concepts and Considerations for the Employment Service Professional. And just by way of introduction, I am an extension associate / training specialist here at the Yang Tan Institute at Cornell. And I've been doing this for about 10 years. But prior to that, for even longer than I've been a trainer, I was, like you, in many ways, an employment service professional. I started out my work career a long time ago as a younger man, as a job coach, job developer, and director of employment for an organization here in upstate New York, where I live. And one thing I always say is when I moved to Cornell, and part of my work, we work on a lot of different projects. And one of the big projects I work on, actually, I'll move the slide because it's perfect timing, is the Northeast ADA Center. And we are a part of the ADA National Network, right? And so there are 10 federally funded ADA centers across the country. It just so happens that I am in Federal Region 2, which is New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But wherever you are, there's a map of the country here with numbers and regions. You have an ADA center in your region. And the beauty of the ADA centers is we provide training, technical assistance, consultation, etc., on a variety of topics surrounding the ADA. If you have questions after today about the ADA or anything about that, you or people you know, and we get employers calling us, architects calling us, families calling us, there is a 1-800 number for you, 1-800-949-4232. It is routed to the ADA center in your region by the area code you're dialing from. Of course, you all know me too, and you're welcome to ask me your ADA questions, or bring them to the office hours next month, because I will be there. But when I started the work I do specifically for the ADA Center, I thought I knew a lot about the ADA. I had worked for 17 years as an employment professional, and I realized when I started really looking at the ADA, I knew this much, and I'm holding up two fingers like really close together. You know, the ADA is broad, it's vast, and there's just so much to know. So I hope today in this conversation and presentation that it'll at least give you a little more information, you know, for you to have in your toolkit, in your work with employers and job seekers, families, others, in your work at Best Buddies. So there's a slide here with a lot of text, and basically what I'm going to tell you is that this is the I'm not a lawyer slide. Anything I talk about today, you know, is not meant to be a determination of legal rights. I'm an educator. We're all educators here at Cornell. And so I will hopefully help you determine and learn about what the ADA says. We really look at the EEOC, which enforces Title I, the employment provisions of the ADA, and really try to follow their guidance. So what I am talking about, you know, will really be based upon what the ADA says. And as with anything, we have two fancy words we use here at Cornell when it comes to different situations about the ADA, and it depends, right? Because it depends on the person, depends upon the situation, depends on the accommodation, depends on the employer, and every situation is different. So just know that I'm here to share information and knowledge as an educator, not legal advice. So anyone that knows the training sessions that I do knows that, you know, what makes the training go from good to great is some engagement. And in this virtual Zoom world, we have so few ways to sort of engage, unlike when we're in person. You know, I used to do a lot more in person back in the day before the pandemic. So we have polling questions. You can type in the chat box. You can unmute and speak. I don't know if I missed anything. So we're going to start with a polling question. And I think we're going to try a short answer format. So if Alex wants to bring up the poll, the question, I'd love for you to respond to this question. And it is, when I think of disability disclosure and workplace accommodations, one thought, concern, or question I have is blank. So.
And Jeffrey, looks like the polling is not working right now. So why don't, for this question, we have people put this in the chat box.
Absolutely. We can always default to is it just this question or beyond this question, Alex?
You know, it's giving me an error message that wasn't happening before.
So Alex and I just did a dry run before the training and it was all perfect. Go figure. You know, that's how it goes. But it's all good. We can use the chat. So if you want to type in the chat, that would be fine as well. You can type it to everyone. You can type it specifically just to me or Alex, or, you know, if you don't want to specifically share your name, but I see here. So again, the question is, when I think of disability disclosure and workplace accommodations, one thought, concern, or question I have is, and we'll give you a minute, are accommodations not meaningful or supported by employers? So I think that question or comment is that sometimes employers maybe don't support accommodations. I want to make sure I'm understanding that one, right? Let's see.
Yes,
here.
it's just meaning that sometimes some of my participants have accommodations that they feel are appropriate for them to be employed, but they maybe think that their employer will not accommodate them because they might be silly, or it might be just something that helps him get through the day with like a certain type of mouse or a fidget. So that's just one of my things that I wanted to write in.
Well, I appreciate you writing. This is Christina, right?
Yes.
Because I don't see the screen. I just see the chat box now. I don't see your
Yes.
picture the way I'm set up here. So yeah, we will be talking about, hopefully addressing that in a few different ways through our conversations about disability disclosure, our section on reasonable accommodation. So thanks for sharing that. Let's see. Thoughts on what to do when requesting reasonable accommodations, but the manager's not open. Very similar question. And it's often, as you say here, Rebecca, lack of knowledge, lack of information, lack of understanding about what the ADA says. So we will talk about that. think that should come up today. And if any of these don't come up today, bring them to the office hours as well for further conversation. What type of education are HR employees offered about the ADA? What should they know, and how do we approach educating individuals who may misunderstand? That's $1 million question, isn't it, Kelsey? You know, our role as employment professionals is to educate, but that's the science that we know, and then the how and the where and the when is the art, right, of how and where and when we do educate.
Yeah, I never want them to feel like I never want them to come across that I know more, because they're obviously the professionals in their field, but sometimes I come across them saying, well, that's not right. And it's like, how do I navigate that?
Yeah. And sometimes HR does know a lot, and sometimes they don't, right? It really depends, or, you know, or are misinformed. And I often talk about using the ADA, you know, as a, what do I say? As a shield and not a sword. You know, we're not here. I'm here to partner with you. That's my whole business engagement mantra, right? So how can I partner with you by offering you information, right? Versus I'm here to threaten you with the ADA, which of course is what we don't want to do in most situations. Yep. Let's see. Oh yeah, the whole piece about unfair treatment, quote unquote, coworkers thinking it's unfair and probing questions. I do believe I addressed that as well. And the confidentiality of accommodations. Is an interpreter an accommodation mandated by the ADA? I can actually answer that. Short answer. Generally, yes, Camille, but you know, it certainly can depend, but more, and it would depend on the size of the business and their resources, but more often than not, it is. Would the interpreter be provided by Best Buddies or the employer? We will talk about that. You know, I don't want to speak for what Best Buddies does, but I will say that employers are responsible for accommodating their employees ultimately. Oh, Kathy, thank you. I forgot all your vast experience. As someone who worked with HR professionals for decades, most know not I didn't want to come out and say that, but I often feel that people are very misinformed, right? Or have just a little bit of knowledge and then, you know, kind of make it this blanket thing. And Christina, and this will be the last one I want to move us forward here. I love this part of the training though, and thank you so much. You asked about documentation, right? And employers we'll talk about employers' right to substantiate disabilities, particularly non-obvious disabilities. Those were awesome questions and comments, and really sets the tone for what we're going to do here today. I'd just like you to know as well, I've shared this in other sessions, and really quickly, related to the ADA and knowledge, this is a tool that you can use, the Small Business at Work Toolkit that we developed as a result of some of our research with small businesses and their ADA knowledge needs specifically. Although I'll tell you, the tools we've developed, which we know we have resources, we have case scenarios, we have checklists of what to do, what not to do, are often applicable to businesses of any size, you know, and we found that employment professionals like yourselves really love the toolkit. So check it out at smallbusinessatwork.org. I am not selling you anything. It is entirely free. Remember, we're educators. Maybe if I was a lawyer, I'd sell it to you, but I'm an educator. All right. So, well, actually, I mentioned our Small Business at Work research, and couple things related to that I will share that we learned. We learned that, you know, some barriers to including people with disabilities in specific to small businesses, although I think some of these are going to resonate with you, with lots of folks you work with who are in businesses, where they were sort of clustered in 3 areas. One is that small businesses, these employers, lack ADA related knowledge, you know, things like they don't understand or know how disability is defined under the law. Right? What do we even mean by disability? You've highlighted it in your comments. Limited understanding about accommodations and the concept of reasonable accommodation and implementation of accommodations, among other things. I know number 2, fear and stigma persist, is not a shocker for all 60 of us here, right? We know that, but the the research sort of validated that in the work with small employers. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about the cost of employing people with disabilities, concerns about accommodation costs, and it does influence employers' decisions, sometimes unfairly, right? To hire and accommodate people with disabilities. And many businesses, particularly small businesses, I will say, lack those internal policies and processes, to implement disability inclusive practices, right? And there's a lot I could say about that, so that sometimes people don't know what their policy or practice is, even if they have one. And businesses have to be careful, and this is where we can support them, because, if you don't have a process, you might have one sort of uneducated rogue manager doing something that's highly contrary to the ADA. I'm cautious to say illegal because I'm not a lawyer, and so our role is really to partner and educate and help and support, right? And I know that's the spirit of Best Buddies and what you all do. So, and then the only other slide I want to share for now, at least related to that research, is that, because I can't possibly cover all that we learned through this project, through our Small Business at Work project. But the top 5 information needs of managers and employees were, and some of these may resonate with you for sure. One is, what can I ask an applicant or employee about their disability? And by the way, if one is an employee or you're someone who's supporting employees with disabilities, you just reverse this question, right? It might be, what can they ask me, or what can they ask the person that I support, the participant, about disability? But from an employer perspective, that was a question. What can or cannot I ask? How do I recognize when an employee discloses? We're going to talk about that. Being able to even recognize a disclosure, the start of a disclosure conversation. How do I respond to an accommodation request? Some of that came up in your comments. What do I do? Sometimes people don't even recognize that it's a request for an accommodation, or maybe turn it down, kind of out of hand, and when in fact it might actually be reasonable, versus having that conversation. We call that the interactive process. I'll talk about that. How's disability defined under the ADA? Disability is a lot more than what's obvious to us or what we may see or experience. And what is my organization's accommodation process, right? Many times people didn't know that as well. So today, I like to share some of that and get your thoughts before I get to sort of these are some of our objectives. Frankly, I think we probably cover even more than this, but I hope you'll understand the overarching purpose of the ADA today, after today, and maybe after our office hours as well, if we extend to our office hours coming up. I hope you'll be able to identify some of the key elements of Title I, the employment provisions of the ADA, that will cover disclosure, accommodation, among other things. And then what are those key factors for you to consider in your work with employers, and your work with job seekers and supported employees with disabilities? And then I will talk about, I hope, I have it at the end. There's a lot of questions about this concept of undue hardship and direct threat under the ADA and what that actually means. So remember I told you that when I thought I knew a lot about the ADA, then I discovered I knew this much, that little bit. I want to just do a really brief kind of overview because the focus of this training is on Title I, the employment provisions of the ADA. But I think it's important to have just a little bit of background and a little bit of an overview of that as well. So the ADA has 5 titles. Today we're covering Title I, which prohibits discrimination in all employment processes related to disability. But Title II talks about accessibility in public entities. Think about state and local government entities. Not only physical accessibility, getting in the building per se, which we often think of, but making sure that programs are accessible to people with disabilities as well, and how we deliver programs to people. Title III is similar to Title II, except that it talks about and covers accessibility in private businesses. And that could be things, places we all shop and do business, restaurants, hotels, stores, etc. Private doctor's offices. Title IV talks about communications, telephone relay systems and communications. Closed captioning came as a result of Title IV. And Title V is a catch-all. One thing I always point out is that Title V protects people with disabilities from retaliation, right? And so, for example, if someone were to request an accommodation and not get the accommodation and the employer fired them, right? Or someone filed a charge with their state human rights entity because they felt they were discriminated against, and the employer, this actually happened with a business in Florida, speaking of Florida, Kim, they discharged an elderly couple who requested a sign language interpreter because they filed a charge. That's retaliation, and that's not good. So enough about that. The ADA, I really cherry-picked this slide. It says qualified individuals with disabilities. What does qualified mean, right? And I cherry-picked this slide because there's all those myths out there that we know exist about, oh, people with disabilities can't work. They can't do the same work as other people. It's going to be expensive to have them here. And all those myths that are out there, right? So I always like to remind us, and when I talk to employers, I have similar conversations with employers to remind us that in order to be a qualified individual with a disability, to access the benefits of Title I of the ADA, the employment provisions, the job candidate or employee has to have the skills and experience necessary to perform the job, right? This isn't charity, right? And I think you know this, right? Employment is not charity, and our services aren't about charity. It is about ensuring that you have a candidate that helps get the job done, right? That's why the job exists, because there's a job to get done. My family's run a small business for 77 years. I know some of you heard me talk about that in the past. And at the end of the day, my family that runs that small restaurant needs to make sure that the restaurant is thriving. And then the other thing I always like to remind us of, and it just circled it, is that, and this is the question employers can ask, this is the question that our employers can ask us, is that, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation, right? It's about leveling the playing field so that if someone has a disability as they're applying for a job, they can respond yes without disclosing a disability before being hired, because you're not required to do that, right? You're hired on your merits, just as someone who doesn't have a disability could also answer yes to this question, right? So I always like to start with, you have to be able to meet the sort of skills and experience requirements that employers have for the job. But accommodations do come into play. So the ADA was signed into law. It says a snapshot. I always say, you may hear me say the spirit of the ADA. Certainly the ADA is a law, but the spirit of the ADA is, how it's applied in our world, right? And it was signed into law, hard to believe, 33 years ago, or 34 almost years ago, on July 26, 1990, by President Bush, our first President Bush. And there's a photo here of him signing the ADA into law with his supporters around him. The quote here from Justin Dart, one of the founders of the ADA, is one of my favorites. The ADA is the Civil Rights Act of the future. The ADA actually was signed into law about 30 years after the Civil Rights Act of the 60s and was predicated upon that. It had bipartisan support at the time. What a concept, right? Imagine that. And President Bush, when he, among other things that he said, this one quote that he gave was, it's the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. So basically, I'd just like to remind us here that we know the ADA, and under the ADA that people with disabilities experience workforce and beyond the workforce discrimination. That certainly is the reason ADA exists. But I also like to remind us, the other box up here says, balancing the interests of the business community and hiring individuals who will be productive employees. There are some protections in place for businesses as well to ensure, as best we can, they have productive employees to get the job done, right? One of them actually is that someone asked that question about asking for documentation to substantiate a disability. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. At the end of the day, the heart of the matter, if you've been to any of our trainings before, there's an image of an artichoke up here. The heart of the matter is that the ADA is about non-discrimination. It is a civil rights law. It is a law, right? but, you know, the spirit of the ADA goes beyond the law. You know, the ADA is kind of a bare minimum, you know, but certainly, you know, the spirit is full inclusion of all Americans who happen to have disabilities into society, and in the case of Title I, into the world of work. So we have, I cannot talk about the ADA, Title I, without talking about a few things: disability disclosure, reasonable accommodation, the interactive process, which I'll discuss. And although I kind of broke it into sections, this is the disclosure section, that the accommodation sections later, the reality is it all blends together, right? And so I'm going to start you with a scenario, and all I want you to do, as I think Kim just, I find in trainings, it's always nice to have another voice rather than just me, you know? And so Kim or Alex are going to read Dale's scenario to you. And if you wouldn't mind, as they're reading the scenario, just think about it. If you were Dale or you were working with Dale, what would you do? How would you support Dale? There's really no wrong answer here, and feel free to type that into the chat. So who's my reader for this one? Kim, is that you?
Sure.
Thank you.
So let's talk about Dale. You are working with Dale, who 3 months ago returned from active duty. Dale has now completed military service and is in the process of returning to civilian life. A week after returning from deployment, Dale was back on the job as a customer service representative in the IT department of a software company. A month later, Dale is struggling, not sleeping well, having difficulty concentrating, feeling very sad, and is on edge around people. After going to the doctor, Dale was just diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and has started treatment. Now, Dale has an additional worry. What should I do about my job? For the most part, Dale is performing on the job, but is having difficulty with face-to-face interactions, such as customer outreach or attending staff meetings.
It would help if I unmute. Thank you, Kim. So thinking about Dale's scenario for a minute here. Oh, wait, let's go back here. Sorry. If you were working with Dale, what advice might you give, or how would you handle this? You know, Dale in this situation is not disclosed a disability, feels that they need an accommodation, but also is concerned about, you know, being treated differently, right? Or discrimination, which is a very real concern for people. So what thoughts do you have on how you might support Dale in your role as employment professional? No wrong answer here, right? There really isn't.
I'm driving, so I hope you don't mind if I unmute. But I
love that you're speaking. Hi, who is this? Because I don't see the screen.
This is Lay.
Hi, Lay.
I'm from California.
Awesome.
I think one of the first things that I would do is go to the employer and request if there's like a digital accommodation that they can make. Like maybe Dale can attend the meetings via Teams if they can set up like a computer or something. Because I feel like that's a good option where he can still attend the meetings, but doesn't have to like deal with the intense anxiety that comes with it for the time being.
Yeah, that's great. You know, if in fact Dale is, you know, we're working with this employer and they are aware of who we are and our relationship with Dale, certainly suggesting creative accommodations can be, you know, one way to go about this. Obviously, making sure it's something, you know, that we include Dale in that conversation as well. Thank you so much, Lay. Kathy said, I would suggest to him, speak with HR, ask for an accommodation when it comes to face-to-face meetings, maybe suggest Zoom team or team attendance. Yeah. What about the part about Dale not being sure if they want to disclose, right? Kind of hasn't even really gotten to that point. You know, one thing I want us to think about too is, you know, what if, you know, and then there's different levels of disclosure. Someone may know that I'm working with a job coach, but may not necessarily know every aspect of my disability. And sometimes people acquire or need additional accommodations over time, right? So, few things. I'll share a few points that I think are important for us to consider. So in this situation, right, This is Dale. If Dale doesn't come forward, there may be a risk of losing the job because of performance issue. Employers are always allowed and perhaps expected to focus on performance for any of us, right? If the employer is unaware that Dale has a disability that requires an accommodation and Dale hasn't requested it, stakes are pretty high here and Dale could be at risk of losing the job. This also touches on the topic that many of us know about organizational climate and workplace culture. Dale needs an accommodation, but will Dale feel safe coming forward, right? What's the culture of that organization? Companies where people are respected and there's trust, you know, tend to be places where people are going to feel more comfortable disclosing, right? Versus if I feel like, and that doesn't even have to be disability. If I feel like my manager or HR hasn't treated someone fairly for whatever reason, I might be pretty concerned about coming forward with a disability disclosure request. So our job becomes ultimately helping people weigh the pros and the cons of disability disclosure. You know, our job isn't to tell someone what to do, you know, and there might be a question to this effect later, but it's really because disclosure is a very personal decision. It's a legally protected right, and what's right for Dale may not be right for someone else. So, but helping support the individual, the person, to weigh the pros and cons of disclosure is important. And I see we have some comments in the chat. Yeah, absolutely. If Dale, it did say Dale started treatment, right? And seeking a therapist, I think. Dale could ask the professional their opinion and preference, certainly. That is another support. Well, and talk to the manager that Dale has respect for and is comfortable with to see what the process is, right? There's that whole trust piece, right? It's so important because if you don't have that, it's going to be a much harder conversation to have. So Dale, like anyone who is concerned, wondering about disclosure, may have a few questions, right? These may be questions that go through anyone's mind who's debating, should I or shouldn't I disclose? Or what should I disclose about my disability? Things like, first of all, does the disability impact my job? That's the number one reason people disclose, is because you need an accommodation. And if, you know, there are many times that many of us here probably have a disability that would be covered under the ADA that may have nothing to do with our ability to perform our job. So it has to have an impact on the job. We've talked about the manager. There's concerns, and someone asked this or brought this up before. What if my coworkers find out? How do I handle that? No, there are some confidentiality requirements when it comes to disclosure and when it comes to accommodations about who needs to know what. We've talked about work culture. We've talked about trust, right? So this is why also I think when in some of our other classes, job development class, business engagement class, job retention class, you know, whatever other courses we do, I often say that the assessing workplace culture is so critical, right? In environment and making sure there's a good match, because there are so many other, those are the factors that promote job retention, you know, and trust in the workplace. So what is disability? It's not just what you see. It's not just what is visible. There are many disabilities out there that are either invisible or non-obvious, right? And sometimes people with non-obvious disabilities have concerns about disclosing and sharing. Maybe it's that they don't think someone will believe them. Maybe it's that they're concerned that they'll be treated differently as a result of that. Maybe it's that it'll be dismissed. I think somebody even said this before, that it'll not be taken seriously. Our colleagues here at Cornell, there we go, did some research, and I often like to share some of the results of this. And what they asked people was, what are the very important factors for you when deciding to disclose a disability to your employer? And right at the top is the need for an accommodation, right? People disclose usually, but not always, because they need an accommodation. Sometimes people disclose because it's a part of your identity and who you are, and you want people to know. I know some people on the autism spectrum, or some people in the deaf community, you know, want people to know right away, this is a part of who I am, what have you. But generally speaking, the number one reason people disclose is they need an accommodation. And not too far behind that, you'll see things like supportive supervisor relationship and a disability friendly workplace, that all those workplace culture factors that we talked about. They also ask the reverse question. And the reverse question is, what are the very important factors when deciding not to disclose a disability to the employer? So what would discourage you, Dale, or any of us who might want to come forward with a disability? What would discourage you from disclosing? And far and above all the responses is the risk of being fired for someone who's already employed, or the risk of being not hired, because we will talk about people can disclose at any point in the process, including during the hiring interview process, not onboarding, because I think that's after you're working. During the hiring process, people could disclose if they need, particularly if they need an accommodation. So, and there people are often worried that people will focus on their disability and not their ability. All those things I'm sure you know. And I always like to say that people have sometimes very valid reasons in their minds, in their experiences, for not disclosing, right? I've worked with people who have mental health disabilities, and more often than not, I've heard people with diagnoses of mental illness or what have you, saying that they don't disclose because they are very worried about stigma and being treated differently. So that's why it's so important to help people weigh the pros and the cons. And this isn't just a survey and a study, right? Because, another study that our colleagues did, actually our director and one of our other colleagues at Cornell, found that 30% of people who responded, who asked for an accommodation, reported experiencing one or more types of issues that we just talked about on the prior list. People were worried about maybe their employer focusing on their disability over their performance, or being treated differently, or loss of growth and advancement opportunities. So I know I said this more than once, but it always comes back to weighing those pros and cons and helping people make the right decision for them, right? It's not enough to say, oh, don't worry about it. You have a right to disclose and your employer has to provide an accommodation. We know in reality, that may be what the law says. We know in reality, sometimes things don't always play out as nicely as we would like. And so it's just important to be informed and educated and help people make that informed choice. All right, Alex, what did we say? The polls are still doing error messages?
Yeah, they are still down. So I just posted in the chat.
Okay.
I think someone's logged into this account elsewhere, and it's messing things up. But we'll just be adaptable as this work calls for sometimes.
Absolutely, it's really no big deal. This happens quite frequently. So okay, so here's the next question. You can just respond in the chat or out loud. In most situations, is an employer allowed to inquire about disability pre-hire? In other words, are they allowed to, under the ADA, to ask about disability or medical conditions or what have you before someone's been offered a job? What do you think? Oh, we got lots coming in already. No. Yep. I mean, yes, no. No, but some do. Well, Ashanti, yes, some do. I've had it. We know that happens. And so we have to be prepared to respond to that if it does happen. But yes, under the ADA, right, it might prompt them to ask and, illegal questions. So under the ADA, and I'll address this a little further here, employers, for the most part, are not allowed to ask about disability pre-hire. Remember the spirit of the ADA? It's about judging someone on their merits, right? And I will say again that often when we talk about this disclosure, it's often for people with non-visible or non-obvious disabilities, right? So generally speaking, and I guess I'm going to back up a minute, because historically, prior to the ADA, and we know even now, many employers, certainly prior to the ADA, asked job applicants and employees to provide information about their physical or maybe mental health conditions. And the reality was that this information was used to exclude or otherwise discriminate against people in employment despite their ability to do the job. So the ADA's provisions concerning disability-related inquiries and medical examinations, are in place for a reason, right? So that the individual gets judged on their merits, right? On their ability to perform the job, on their background, their experience, whatever else that people in general are judged based upon. So generally, employers can't make any pre-offer inquiry about the disability or the nature or severity of the disability. I have an asterisk because there is one narrow exception, and the narrow exception is if the disability is obvious or apparent. An employer does have some limited ability to ask. They could ask, for example, if the applicant has a known disability, they can ask somebody to either tell them or demonstrate how they would perform the essential functions of the job. So that's the narrow exception, right? After the job offer, and I see there's a couple comments in the chat here. After the job offer, but before the work begins, right? The employers of anyone can actually collect some medical information, right? And as long as it's required of everybody, they can't say, I'm going to ask this guy, Jeffrey, because there's something about him I'm not so sure about to provide medical documentation, but I'm not going to ask Alex because I don't know, he seems okay, right? It has to be fairly and consistently applied to all employees. But if the documentation revealed a disability that prevents the applicant from performing an essential function and it can't be accommodated, they could withdraw the offer. But when we talk about later about direct threat and undue hardship, we'll talk about this can't be based on speculation and myth. It has to be something that's very concrete and very specific. So I already mentioned the narrow exception, right? So I won't cover that again. So let's try. Oh, actually, let me pause here. Let's see. Oh, no, just more comments about what we talked about before. Okay. So let's try typing in the chat. We'll just do type in the chat or speak aloud. I have some questions here on the screen, and these questions here are in the category of job performance. What questions of the ones I'm going to share, question or questions, are employers allowed to ask, right? And the first one's pretty easy. So here are the questions. Do you have a disability? This is number one. Do you have a disability that would prevent you from performing the job? Number two is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? And number three is, what physical or mental impairment do you have that would affect your job performance? I already kind of gave you the answer to this, but I put it in here on purpose. What can an employer ask? 1, 2, or 3, or more than one of these? Just type in 1, 2, or 3. Yep, you guys know that, right? Of course it's 2, right? So, of course, the question is 2. Are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? I keep driving this point home because I think a lot of times when I talk to employment professionals about what employers can and can't ask, there's sometimes some confusion. Like sometimes people say, oh, they can ask, do you need an accommodation? Well, even I'm glass half full guy, even the employer that may be well-intended, wants to actually be supportive and accommodate. Asking someone if you need an accommodation is asking them to disclose their disability, right? So that's not allowable. That's why I post this question. Okay, let's try another one. This is about attendance. Certainly employers can ask certain questions and expect attendance and punctuality or whatever of any of us, right? So 1, 2, or 3, what can an employer ask? Keeping in mind that more than one could be correct. Number 1, how many days were you out sick during your last job? Number 2, can you meet our attendance requirements? And number 3, how many days were you absent from your last job? What can an employer ask? 1, 2, 3, or more than one if you think it's more than one. Let's see here. It's hard to know where the last 2 stopped and these 2 started, but it looks like I'm getting some 2s. I got at least 1, 2, and 3. I have another 2 and 3. So I will tell you that you're all right. But Julie and Kathy and Christina are especially right because the answer is 2 and 3. Obviously, I think it's obvious that asking number 1 about how often you were sick could be, you know, a disability, a veiled or not so veiled disability inquiry. Employers are allowed to have attendance requirements and ask any of us about meeting whatever that requirement is, whether it's this is the shift or this is when we need you, blah, blah, blah. That would not lead someone to have to disclose a disability necessarily. And then the distinction between number 3 and number 1 is asking about absences is different than asking about being sick or ill, or an illness, right? Or a disability, because people are absent from their jobs for many different reasons, not just for disability related reasons. So that's the distinction there. Nice job, folks. And I think I have one more. This one's a little trickier for some people. And this is about drug and alcohol use. I think we know that, you know, substance abuse is a covered disability under the ADA. I'm no expert on that topic, but just that's the blanket statement. So what can employers ask about drug and alcohol use? And the questions are, number 1, are you currently using illegal drugs? Number 2, what medications are you currently taking? Number 3, have you ever been treated for drug addiction? Number 4, have you ever been convicted for driving under the influence of alcohol? And number 5, have you ever participated in an alcohol rehab program? So which one, or it could be more than one, that's correct here.
Isn't it like,
What do you think?
I think, right.
So I see, let's see here, 1 and 4. 3, 4, and 5. Bunch of 4s. Yeah. 3 and 4. So yeah, I told you this one's a little bit trickier, especially if we don't have a lot of kind of knowledge about substance abuse in the ADA. You know, so the correct answers are 1 and 4. And 1 is, are you currently using illegal drugs? Employers never have to allow or tolerate, if I can use that word, the use of illegal drugs in the workplace, or in or out if it impacts work. So that is a question they can ask. And number 4, have you ever been convicted? Frankly, could even say arrested, but whatever. Have you ever been convicted for driving under the influence? Because that alone doesn't indicate, you know, an ADA covered disability, someone who maybe has gotten a DUI, or we call it DWI here in New York. Medications certainly could lead to connecting the dots to a disability. Being treated for drug addiction, someone who's gone through treatment, that is a covered disability under the ADA. Employers are not allowed to inquire into their treatment status, and the same with alcohol rehab as well. So nice job, folks. All right. So whenever I go through, and when I've done this, especially in person, this sort of conversation, whenever I go through the employers can ask about disability during the job interview before someone's hired conversation, I actually have changed my PowerPoint around on purpose to put what I'm about to share with you here, because I'll usually get someone raising their hand or saying, no, Jeffrey, and here's the question or the statement I'll get. You know, something like, you know, hey, Jeffrey, they'll say, I noticed a checkbox or a form, if it's a paper application, a checkbox, if it's online, or, you know, whatever, with the job application, inviting the applicant to self-identify a disability. I thought employers can ask about disability before someone's hired, pre-hire. And so it's an important time to share the distinction between what I've been discussing about disclosure and this concept of self-identification. And I'm just pausing at the chat here. Bye, Christina. Thank you for nice hearing your voice today. Someone asked, would these rules, the drug and alcohol, change if the job in question was a pharmacy or bar? Matthew, without further dialogue, I would say I don't believe that the questions would change, but certainly this is something we could discuss more. In fact, if you come to office hours, let's talk more about that. But I don't believe so. That's the short answer, right? A lot of times we need further kind of delving into this. So employers have always been allowed to invite, and that's a key word, invite job applicants, current employees to self-identify as having a disability. Actually, there are other areas of self-identification, such as veterans. That's just another example, for the purposes of affirmative action. For all of us here, it's important to know about Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, because that's a law that prohibits federal contractors and subcontractors from discriminating in employment against people with disabilities, right? It requires that employers take affirmative action to recruit, hire, promote, and retain people with disabilities. And when I say federal contractors, this doesn't mean, you may know this, but it's not just people in Washington, D.C., for those of you that are in that area, right? There are people that have federal contracts all over the country and companies that have federal contracts, right? It's the whole idea of federal government as model employer. So there's a few things on here about Section 503. It doesn't just talk about self-identification, but I'm going to focus on the self-identification piece, which employers who are federal contractors are required to seek voluntary self-identification of disability at the time of application. So when you apply for a job, that's why you might see it on that job application at the time of hire. So once someone is offered a job, and intermittently of current or incumbent employees. So the information is required to be kept in a separate file. The information does not go to the hiring manager. It is, kept totally separate. It does not influence the hiring decision. In fact, and actually, just to give you an example, and there's a form on here. It's a voluntary self-identification form. It's actually the form that we Cornell people get as employees. I got this in my inbox a few months ago because Cornell must be, I'm assuming, a federal contractor, and it invited me and all of us here to self-identify. It actually, this form, the Cornell one, and invited me to say, why I'm being asked to complete the form. How do you know if you have a disability? They suggested disabilities. Federal contractors want people to self-identify because it's one of those metrics that they're being measured by. How many people how are you recruiting people with disabilities, right? And by the way, they're supposed to be partnering with people like you, those pipelines of talent. How many people are you interviewing? How many people have you hired? They're not going to know the answer to that unless you self-identify, or unless people self-identify. And the answers are yes, I have a disability, or have had one in the past. No, I don't. Or I don't want to answer. One can answer any way that they want. It's important for you to know, because it's important. People get nervous when they see it, and it has no bearing on the decision to hire someone. So in a nutshell, the difference between disclosure and self-identification is that disclosure involves telling an employer about a disability usually it's when someone is requesting a job accommodation. Suppose someone else, again, could disclose for other reasons, but often that's the reason. That is disclosure, usually to your supervisor, the hiring person, or maybe HR. In fact, people are more likely, I think 60%, another statistic, more likely to disclose to their supervisor or manager than to HR, which is why it's so important for those managers to be educated about the ADA and what it says about disclosure and accommodation. Self-identification, just to wrap that up, refers to self-reporting a disability to support an employer's documentation of disability representation among their applicants and workforce for affirmative action. Sometimes people ask me, well, could there be any advantage for me as an employment professional in my relationship building with certain employers to let them know that this isn't violating anyone's, confidentiality. Let them know that I represent a pool of job applicants and job candidates who might be able to meet your needs, as a federal contractor when it comes to self-identification, right? Sometimes that can kind of give us a foot in the door, there's no absolutes, but looking for opportunities to partner with who these federal contractors are could be a business engagement strategy. And oh my gosh, I think the website where you can search them, my colleague Elise Schweitzer always tells me this, is usajobs.gov, I think. But if someone finds that I'm wrong, please type in the right one. There's a place you can search federal contractors in your region. So there's a picture here of a rabbit in a hat with a magic wand. And this slide says no magic words. And I like to remind us that when it comes to disclosure, it's important for you and I to know, it's important for our employer partners to know, there are no magic words, right? Well, first of all, the interactive process, which I'll talk about in a moment, starts with someone disclosing a disability or medical condition of some kind, whatever, something in one of those categories. It's not all disabilities or medical conditions, you know what I mean? So, and the disclosure conversation can start with something as simple and benign as, because of X medical condition or disability, I'm having trouble with Y job duty. Someone doesn't have to even use the word disability. I know I did in my example here. Someone doesn't have to mention the ADA. They don't have to mention the word accommodation. They don't have to mention the word disclosure, right? If someone is sharing that due to some sort of condition, be it medical or some other sort of disability, that they're having trouble with a certain job duty, right? Again, the connection is between the situation or condition and the job duty. You have a disclosure conversation, right? So I often tell businesses, and you can tell them this too if you think it's helpful, that this really should be a stopping point for managers, right? To sort of stop and think, okay, what is our process as a company, as an organization? I'll be honest with you, I was a manager many years ago when I ran an employment program, and I probably had a couple of examples of colleagues, coworkers that came to me with something that I didn't realize was probably a disclosure. One I can think of as someone, I don't remember the exact language anymore because the language does matter, but someone coming to me and requesting a different chair because their chair was, bothering their back or uncomfortable. And I remember at the time, it was a long time ago, I probably botched it. Fortunately, we didn't get in trouble. But the reality was, I probably went through my head was, oh my gosh, we're a nonprofit. It takes an act of God to get money out of, and how all. But the reality was, if this person said, due to a back condition, I'm getting treatment for this, and I think I need another chair, I botched it. I denied their accommodation request. Now, if they just say it's a little uncomfortable, that's a whole different thing. So no magic words when it comes to disclosure. So you've heard me talk about this interactive process. I have to tell you, when I went to work for Cornell and do my work on the ADA Center, after all the years of employment, employment services, again, I was direct service for many years. I was director of a program. I did a lot of work in my community, when it came to employment disability. I don't think I knew anything about what the ADA means by the interactive process. So the ADA requires employers to provide effective, reasonable accommodations for job applicants and employees. So it's not just employees, people applying for jobs can also request accommodations. Obviously, that probably means if your disability isn't apparent, you have to disclose. And to help determine effective accommodations, the EEOC, again, they enforce Title I of the ADA. They recommend, I think they even require, that employers use what's called an interactive process. And here's the thing. An interactive process the concept is simple. In practice, it may not be simple. In fact, I know it's not simple from things you've all said. And it basically means that employers and employees work together to come up with effective accommodations. It's meant to be a conversation. It's meant to be timely. It's meant to be a back and forth. I know that's not how it always feels. I've been in, by the way, you as the support person with consent, just like you do as job coaches, can certainly request accommodations or be involved in that discussion, as I know many of you probably have been over, in your work. So it really is about employers and employees working together to come up with effective accommodations. The interactive process, this may be that piece of education with employers that you work with, right? is a critical step in the reasonable accommodation process, right? Think of it as kind of that, and it says here, the interactive process, you know, a two-way street where both parties, the employee and the employer, have responsibilities, and both parties have to respond to the actions of the other, right? And by the way, I know it says employee, but again, if you have their proxy or their consent, you may be the one, you know, providing this information, you know, along with the person you support. So the employee has to make the request, right? It's usually that request for an accommodation. Again, usually for non-obvious disabilities, right? Employers don't need to be, and the EEOC talks about this, requiring documentation of medical necessity for or the need for the accommodation for obvious disabilities. You know, someone's blind and needs, you know, some sort of technology, a screen reader or something to enhance the tech to make it large. Or, you know, someone needs their desk raised because they use a wheelchair, you know. No documentation needed for that. And it, sometimes employers ask, I know that's a whole other thing, but it's making that request for the documentation. Employers can assume, well, they're not supposed to assume someone has a disability. They're not supposed to speculate on a non-obvious disability. In fact, employers can get in a lot of trouble for doing that because it could be treating someone as if they have a disability, whether they do or not, right? You know, the spirit of the ADA means that I have to make that request. I have to disclose. The ball's in my court, right? So the employer can verify the need for the accommodation. And one way that employers can go about this is they can request, well, pardon me, we'll go back here. They can request documentation of the employee to substantiate the condition, the disability from some sort of medical professional. Employers don't have to ask for documentation, but they certainly have a right to under the ADA. In fact, I went to a training session last year in Kansas City at this big national ADA symposium. There is such a thing. And this man was presenting on this whole session about asking for documentation. And one of the things he said was that I found interesting, it's kind of beyond the ADA, is that a lot of employers are actually not necessarily asking for documentation for little things that might be easy to implement. Because we know you have to go to the doctor, the employer has to track it. It puts all these mechanisms in motion. So some employers may not even be asking for, you know, say the accommodation is something really simple or low cost or, you know, things you do all the time, right, in your jobs. They may not have to ask for documentation, but they have a right to if they do ask. Employers have to keep that information confidential. It is not intended and it's not allowed to be in the employee's regular personnel file that anyone can access. It is meant to be kept entirely separate. In fact, the only people that really need to know about the accommodation are usually it's like the supervisor or manager, you know, anyone that needs to know about the change to the work. Coworkers and others do not need to know, should not be told by the employer that someone has a disability or an accommodation. Now, I, as an employee, can tell anyone I want, right? And it might be good to brainstorm with someone, you know, how you want to handle the situation when all of a sudden you have a stool to sit down and no one else does. But having said that, employers are required to maintain that confidentiality. And both employer and employee are required to participate in the process. All right, I'm going to ask you, this is the audience participation part now. I've said a lot about disclosure and accommodation. And so actually these examples I'm going to share are from the EEOC's guide called Reasonable Accommodation and Undue Hardship. There's a lot of guidance out there, and they provide at least some of these examples for our consideration. So what I want you to do is type in the chat if you think this is a request for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. In other words, is this a disclosure conversation? Remember what I talked about before? Related to a disability. And here's one. I'm having trouble getting to work at my scheduled starting time because of medical treatments I'm undergoing. Yes, it is the start, you know, a disclosure, a disability disclosure, or no, it's not. What do you think? Yes or no? Yeah, not hard. I mean, not hard for you and me as we go through this, but in this example, you got it. The employer, not the employer, the employee connected the need for an accommodation, which is some sort of revised work schedule, with a medical treatments or something that's considered a disability. Now, this doesn't mean the accommodation's automatic. That's a whole other thing. This is just the start. Now they would have the employer, employee, you, if you're involved, would have that dialogue and conversation about, you know, the business need and if it's reasonable. But this is the start of that conversation. And often, not always, these requests are considered reasonable under the ADA. Often, not always. Okay, here's another one. I need 6 weeks to get treatment for a back problem. Yes, it is a disclosure or no? I've kind of answered some of these for you, but that's okay. I like just to get our wheels spinning. So we have one, is it one? No, a few of you have said yes. There we go. Yes, of course it is, because in this example, persons, again, tying in the need for time off with back issues. Now, again, this isn't a given. It's not an automatic. It's the conversation ensues from there, but it is the start, and the employer is on notice that this is just the start of a disclosure conversation, and the employers are required to respond in a timely manner to these requests. There's no time frame on it. You know, the ADA doesn't say 1 day, 1 week, 6 days, you know, but they are required to respond. Okay, I'd like a new office chair because my present one is uncomfortable. I may have also answered this one for you. I think you know. Is this a disclosure conversation? No, right. Kind of like I said before. In this example, discomfort is not enough, right? Now, if someone said it's uncomfortable due to some issues I've been having with my back and I've been going to a chiropractor or whatever people do, you know, that would be a very different conversation. But this alone is not sufficient. Right now, the employer certainly could say, employer isn't allowed to ask about disability. Oh, have you been getting back treatment? That's not allowable. But an employer could say, tell me a little more about this discomfort you're experiencing. You know, I'm really curious to know how I can support you with this. First of all, that's just best good practice with any employee who requests something, disability or not. And let's try, I already did this one. My wheelchair can't fit under my desk in my office. Of course, we know that is the start of a conversation. So I'm going to ask you, we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you here to, I guess we're typing in the Q&A, not Q&A, typing in the chat, your response to this question. And it's an important one, so I think it bears repetition. As an employment professional, what role do you play in supporting disclosure? Tell me what you do, maybe what you've done or what you think you would do if you were in the situation, or maybe it's what you have done. You know, some of you have been around a while. What role do you play in supporting disclosure? How does this even come up in your work? Maybe some people are already disclosed. I know a number of people already are that you work with, but imagine you're working with someone with a mental health diagnosis that's not evident. Maybe they have an intellectual disability or developmental disability, but they also may have something that's not apparent, right? You know, I mean, even an intellectual disability isn't usually apparent, right? But what do you do? What is your role in supporting disclosure? And I'll pause a minute. I don't think it's, oh, here we go. I know we trainers get impatient. I've had to learn it takes a while for people to type, right? So thank you for that. Have a conversation with the participant about their feelings and thoughts. Absolutely, Julie, right? We want to certainly start there. Help them practice the conversation, sit in and assist with the participant and manager. Yeah. If they want to disclose and they give consent to do that, certainly we can be a part of that. We could also make sure employee and employer understand what comes, educating about rights and responsibilities. And I love, Rebecca, the whole practice thing, right? You know, practice scripts, getting people, it doesn't come naturally, probably to most of us, right? And so that practice is so important, right? Maybe for us too, just like I tell you to practice your job development spiels and scripts, you know, we do the same thing with job seekers. Yeah, start brainstorming accommodations, when to disclose, what to disclose. It depends. Those are the fancy answers, Kim, right? Those two fancy Cornell words. It depends. It really does depend, you know, on the person and the situation. Love that you're being an ally, Nicole. I know you all do that well at Best Buddies. Assisting people in identifying and requesting them to meet their needs, and advocacy for the implementation, absolutely. And monitoring those accommodations once they're in place. Thank you, Vivi. The right people are involved. Yes, the right time, the right place. The 411 on disability disclosure has some great information on that. Lots of great answers. Absolutely. So you said it way more than this slide, which talks about leading us to the fact that there's no right answer for everyone. It is important. And there's a image up here that says to disclose, to not to disclose, pros and cons. And there's a person with, you know, different arrows pointing in different directions, you know, and it won't be the same for everyone. It may not even be the same for the same person in different situations and circumstances and jobs. Just because they need an accommodation in one job, maybe a different job or a different job duty, I might not need the same accommodation. Just because two people have the same diagnosis in the same situation doesn't mean they need the same accommodation. Diagnosis isn't medical, right? But the reality is the vocational and functional implications of the disability may be very different for different people. So very good. Oh, and speaking of practice scripts, whoever said that a minute ago, I have a couple examples of some things that there's way more in the 411 on disability disclosure. And I think that my colleague Kim and one of my other colleagues are actually, Kim, aren't you guys updating that or involved in the 411 on some way? I don't know if you're still here, Kim, but because I feel like you are actually involved in updating that. But nonetheless,
Yes, we are. I'm sorry. My computer's having significant delays today, so I click and things take forever to actually happen. We are updating the 411 on disability disclosure to make it a more interactive online tool. It probably won't be out, you know, our hope would be by the end of December, but it's going through review by our federal partners, and that takes quite some time.
Awesome. I'm excited for the updates. I love the idea of it being interactive and online. And so we promised you some of our partners like you at Best Buddies will be among the first to know. So here are some examples from the 411. There actually is a hyperlink here. I won't click on it now to the actual tool. But here's an example of when arranging the interview, what someone might say. I'm really looking forward to this interview, and I am checking to make sure that the interview room can accommodate my wheelchair. Here's one after someone's been offered a job, right? Remember, during the hiring process, one does not have to disclose a disability. Even if I know I want an accommodation, one has the right to wait to disclose at any point in time, but often, not always, it is advisable to disclose if you know you need an accommodation after the job offer has been made. Because again, that would be the time for the employer to start having those conversations. So after a job offer has been made, this person said, I find that I work best when instructions are both written and verbal. This helps me process information and be most productive at work. You know, what's interesting about that one is it's a good example of no magic words. This person doesn't have to name the actual disability or diagnosis, but just this conversation about processing, you know, and how learning through different types of mediums puts the employer on notice that this is the start of a disclosure conversation. Now, the employer would have a right, as I said before, they don't have to request documentation to substantiate what is most likely here, processing, you know, a non-evident disability. They don't have to, but they would have a right to. And once the work is begun, because again, someone can disclose at any point in time, I'm having more difficulty than I anticipated keeping up with my coworkers because of my learning disability. In the past, it has helped to work alongside an experienced mentor. I don't know if you noticed anything. There's something else that I talk about that I just thought of that I love about these script examples. Because I often say, I probably always say it, always think of requesting an accommodation. Well, I know you all talk about this because this, I forget, you might have the exact language, as a productivity enhancer. Is that the language you all use at Best Buddies? I know, I remember Stephanie talking to me about that. Say Stephanie Snow, it's Rothy now. But think of, accommodations are not meant to be difficult, onerous, right? The idea is it's just a different way of getting the job done, or a different way of accessing some of the benefits and privileges of employment. So think of disclosure as, how will it increase or at least help the employee maintain their productivity? I always love using that as an example. Oh, thank you, Kathy. I always say productivity enhancers. I guess it's that too. Success enablers, right? And it also goes back to that. How do we present, shatter those myths about what employers might think about accommodations, right? All of these examples really get to, I have the capacity to do this job, and this is something that will help me be my best. We all have accommodations at work, even not necessarily related to a disability. I work remotely. It's not because of a disability, but it makes me more effective and efficient in my work, right? It makes me more content in my work most of the time. If you ever had to ask to leave work early, maybe your kid is sick, or I don't know, I'm training for a marathon and I want to leave at 3 every day. I'll make up the time, at X amount of time. That's an accommodation. It's not related to a disability. But again, I always like to remind employers that we all have them, right? And they make us better at our jobs and more satisfied in our jobs. All right, let's try, forget how many, I have a scenario here, and this is going to be an ABCD choice scenario, okay? And I think we're going to be typing in the chat. So Kim, would you mind, or Alex, reading
Sure.
Danny's dilemma?
All right, Danny. You are working with Danny, a college student with a diagnosis of a seizure disorder. Danny's seizures are well managed with medication, and they have not had a seizure in 5 years. Danny has a job interview coming up next week as a short order cook for a local chain restaurant in your community. They have nearly 3 years prior work experience in high school as a cook and food prep assistant for a local restaurant. Danny excelled in this job and has received a positive recommendation from a former supervisor. Danny asks you if they should disclose their seizure history to the new employer, since their parents expressed concern that the job includes working with sharp knives and around a hot stove. Danny wonders about disclosing for safety reasons, yet they are also concerned about unnecessarily alarming the employer and possibly not getting hired.
Thank you, Kim. So I have worked with people who have seizures, and I have had, I guess I knew enough at the time, I didn't botch this one, to have that conversation about disclosure and what people want to do. So here are the choices for, hold on, I'm sorry, slow advancing here. Okay, what should be done? Which is correct? I don't think you're going to have a hard time with this because it's just going to drive home kind of our key points. A, tell Annie to disclose to the employer to the risk of being injured on the job. B, advise Danny not to disclose due to the risk of not being hired. C, talk it through by weighing the pros and cons of disclosure in this situation. Or D, tell Danny to disclose because it would be dishonest to withhold the information from the employer. And I know you know the answer to this, but I want to talk this through for a minute because it's beyond the question. You're all saying C, of course. Of course, the right answer, we've already said, is to talk it through by weighing the pros and the cons. I already had that big pro and con list, right? Although I will, so that is the answer, absolutely. And it may seem pretty black and white here, but the reality is sometimes it doesn't feel black and white. I remember, we may know somebody and have in our hearts and minds legitimate concerns in this scenario of maybe I am worried, or the parents in this example, that Danny, what happens if you have a seizure? Don't you want people to know? Wouldn't it be best? And that certainly can be a part of our pro and con discussion, right? Maybe that's a con, I don't know. advising Danny not to disclose due to the risk of being hired, right? Maybe, that's a reason not to disclose, right? That's a part of the conversation. And the last part is important because it is never a lie to choose to disclose later in the process, right? So talking it through by weighing those pros and cons. And there really is ultimately, it's giving Danny all the information. The man I worked with years ago, I remember he saying to him, like, Bill, I was a lot younger and kind of less knowledgeable about these topics than I am now. What happens if you have a seizure? And he's like, Jeff, he was a lot older than I was and more worldly. He's like, Jeff, I got this. I don't want to disclose right up front. And he did it, and he got hired. And then, I don't know, a few weeks or months down the line, he decided to tell him once he had that trust in that he felt comfortable with the situation. So, okay. Danny doesn't pose, based upon what we know, a direct threat, of injury to themselves or to anyone else, given what we know about Danny's situation and the state of the seizures. Okay, let's try another one. Kim, if you don't mind reading this one. Danielle and Marta.
All right. So through your supports and services as an employment service professional, Danielle recently was hired as a warehouse assistant. Marta, a warehouse floor supervisor, has come to you with a concern. Yesterday, Danielle told Marta she has attention deficit disorder, or ADD, and needs a reasonable accommodation for a few of her work tasks. Marta, the supervisor, tells you she now feels she's been deceived and that she's not sure she wants to retain Danielle because Marta believes that Danielle lied during the hiring process by not disclosing her disability.
Yeah, so in this example, Danielle got hired on her merits, right? And hadn't disclosed the ADD at that point, and determined somewhere along the way that she needed an accommodation and made the request. And the employer is now concerned because they find it dishonest, what have you. So you're not going to have a hard time with this one either. But again, to drive home our key points, what are the best options? And more than one could be correct. Transfer Danielle to another job in the company. That's A. B, terminate Danielle because she failed to inform her employer of an accommodation when hired, accommodation need. C, begin the interactive process to put the accommodation in place. And or D, educate supervisors about accommodation rights and responsibilities. What's correct? I know this isn't hard, but I'm doing this on purpose. You got it. Right. Our answers are, it's kind of summing up much of what we talked about, C and D. A is not right. We have no reason to believe that, Danielle needs to go to another job, at least not yet. The interactive process begins, the discussion begins about what accommodation Danielle needs. So there's certainly, doesn't mean that job transfer is never considered a reasonable accommodation, because it can be, but there certainly isn't enough information here to make that determination yet. And we already know that terminating Danielle because she didn't inform the employer is wrong. Danielle can disclose at any point she wants. This is that example of Danielle did mention a condition in this example, but there aren't always those magic words, right? Danielle talked about ADD and needing some accommodation. This interactive process starts, right? And I don't know any world where educating supervisors about accommodation rights and responsibilities wouldn't be important, right? That's a part of our role as the employment professional, is to help help educate on the topic of disclosure and accommodation under the ADA. I've had people say with this scenario, the pro and con, we talk about the pros and cons and weighing the pros and cons. So if I'm working with Danielle and she says, well, if I don't disclose up front, will the employer think I'm not being honest, and will that hurt our trust? Now, the straight ADA answer is, the legal answer is, you have a right to disclose at any point in time, right? The other answer is, I can't guarantee that this employer won't interpret it that way, right? So whether or not Danielle considers that a pro or a con, it's a piece of the conversation, because just saying, oh, they can't discriminate against you, the ADA says so, discounts so much else that goes on, as we all know, right, when it comes to the hiring and employment process. So, you know, maybe part of our role there is to provide that education for MARTA, you know, so that MARTA thoroughly understands that, you know, one is able to disclose at any point in time. Maybe it was, you know, Danielle, or maybe Danielle says this, I thought when I started the job, I really thought that I was going to be okay. But now I've discovered that related to my ADD, I need X, whatever it is. X could be something as simple as a partition so I'm not distracted by all the people walking by, right? Okay. All right. Here's what we haven't exactly covered this one. So it's true, false, and you can just type true, false in the chat. An employee who first discloses a disability in response to a termination action cannot be fired because this would constitute discrimination under the ADA. True or false? They cannot be fired because they're about to be terminated and they share they have a disability. What do you think? And I'm curious to know why you think what you think if you so desire, but at least type true or false. Thank you. A lot of falses. Yeah. I know sometimes people aren't sure. Yeah. Mallory, thank you for going out on a limb, and you're absolutely right. Well, you're all right that it's false. So in this example, the reason it is false, because remember what I said before about employers can't speculate on people's disabilities. They can't guess. They can't. We encourage employers to not write down you suspect someone has a disability, or worse yet, say it aloud in a meeting, because that puts you on notice. If the person hasn't disclosed and something happens later, they could come back and say that you, the ADA talks about this, regarded me as having a disability. Remember, the ADA is about the actions that people take and the impact on the individual. So if I assume someone has a disability, whether they do, whether they don't, and they get disparate treatment, I have violated, you know, Title I of the ADA, even if, I always say, even if my intentions are good. Yeah, well, in this example, it is false, right? Because I always say it's not your golden parachute, right? You know, that in the 11th hour, say, oh, hey, I forgot to tell you. I don't know. I have anxiety disorder, so you can't fire me, right? The accommodations are always prospective, you know, moving from today forward. If let's just say this person disclosed and requested an accommodation, right? They aren't, what's the word? Retrospective, retroactive. You know, it's from today forward. The employer can and should judge this employee and any employee on their merits, on their performance, right? Not on a suspected disability or situation. So the employer certainly doesn't have to fire the individual, of course, but they would be within their rights to do so if they so desired. All right, I think, Kim, if you want to read Rhonda, this one we definitely didn't cover, so let's see what you think. You read Rhonda, and then I think this is our last scenario for a few minutes.
Okay, sure. Rhonda and the recordings. Rhonda, a photocopy clerk, has great difficulty reading the many work-related memoranda that her supervisor sends to the office staff. She has no difficulty understanding verbal communication. Rhonda asks her supervisor to record all the memoranda that are distributed. The supervisor asks whether having someone read and explain the memoranda would work instead. Rhonda agrees that it would, but states that her personal preference is to have all memos recorded. So basically, audio, like someone read it, recorded it, and provides it to her.
Right. Yeah. So in this example, you know, Rhonda requests a specific accommodation. The employer says, you know, I don't know about that one, but I have another one. Would that work for you? And Rhonda says yes. So there's your scenario. So what would you do? Or I guess the question really is, what does the ADA say about regarding this scenario? What should the supervisor do? So A, the supervisor does not have to approve either accommodation for Rhonda since they aren't reasonable. B, since both accommodations are effective, the supervisor can decide to have someone read and explain the memoranda to her. C, since Rhonda's preference is to have the memos recorded, the supervisor must choose this accommodation. Or D, Rhonda should start to look for another job since this is not a good job match. I don't mean to laugh at the last one, but sometimes there's a gimme. You know how those multiple choice tests we take in school? Oh, thank you, Julie, if you already left. So what would you choose here? A, B, C, or D? I'll give you a clue. Only one is correct. How about that? It's a little harder, I know.
Well, and Jeffrey, it makes me think about actually the last scenario and this about my days as a teacher
Mm-hmm.
and the things that are asked, like, or requested, that, you know, you have the whole gamut of, is it preference? Is it need? Is it, you know, is it reasonable? There's so many correlations here between what happens in the employment setting and what happens in school. Especially that example about, you know, them disclosing the disability at the time of termination reminds me of, as youth are getting ready to graduate, or students are getting ready to graduate high school, and that's when the parent asks that they be able to stay for an additional year, 2 years, 3 years, you know.
Yeah.
And it was a surprise because all along since 8th grade, 9th grade, the plan has been they're graduating on time. So now all of a sudden there's this, right, request and challenge. So lots of similarities at 2 stages of life here.
Oh, thanks for drawing that parallel, Kim. Yeah. Sometimes these sort of the spirit of these questions don't just apply to work. So I see some B's, I see some C's, I see some B or C. Thanks, Alyssa. I know it's one of those, right? I think we know. So we know it's not A because we don't have enough information to assume that's not reasonable. In fact, it seems one of them does seem reasonable. And I think they've even said it is. And certainly it seems still to be a good job match. So I'll tell you the answer according to the EEOC, right? The answer is B. Since both accommodations are effective, the supervisor can decide to have someone read and explain the memoranda to Rhonda. Now, you know, you could make an argument. I mean, this is just a fun scenario. You can make an argument for C, you know, because the ADA will say that B is correct, but certainly in interacting with the employer, it could make sense to choose Rhonda's preference, right? The ADA would cover them with B. The ADA says that if there's more than one accommodation that's effective, the employer has the right to choose the accommodation as long as it's reasonable. So for example, if one was more expensive, the employer could choose the less expensive one. That doesn't necessarily apply here. And I'll tell you, this is the confusing part of this. I've been at that ADA symposium. The EEOC has been there and has addressed this. And they have said, yes, it's true. The ADA says the employer can pick the one they want. But then they went on to say, but I encourage you employers to let the person decide so there you go, right? But if it were to come up, the employer, you know, maybe that's a part of that interactive process in those discussions and that negotiation about what makes sense. So there's a top 10 list of disclosure up here. I'm not going to read every one here because we've covered most of them, but I put this is here and you have it in the PowerPoint, but this is here for a check for me to make sure that, well, it's that I've covered all of this. Tell only what is needed. I think from the 411 on disability, they actually talk about, you know, tell what the employer needs to know regarding the disability in order to verify the need for the accommodation. I think we've all been in interviews. I can speak for myself with some folks that probably have shared TMI a little too much, in my opinion. It's a judgment, I know, you know, but what is really important? That's where that script and that role playing comes into play. Performance issues are not always about disability, right? People with disabilities have human reactions just like any of us, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. So not to assume everything is about disability as well. And then don't tolerate harassment of any kind at any level in the organization, right? You know, if anyone feels like they're being harassed, I know you're great advocates at Best Buddies, you know, talking to the individual about how they want to handle that, you know, is very important. So lots of resources for you about disclosure. So I said earlier, all these sections blend together. So let's see what we did and didn't cover about reasonable accommodation. So far, throughout this session, the past, 100 minutes, we've moved from talking about disclosure in the interactive process, right? There's a little post-it note with the word disclose on it on screen now, to verification of disability when the employer requests it. There's an image of medical records and files, right? So now we'll continue to talk about, because we've started talking about it, about the concept of accommodation under the ADA. And there's an image of some sort of abstract image on the screen right now with gears and light bulbs. One question, I added this recently into another session I was doing, because a lot of times I'll hear employment professionals say something like, no, privacy, confidentiality is important, but they'll say, oh no, I can't share that with the employer because of HIPAA. Or the employer can't share that or contact the health provider because of HIPAA, right? And the reality is, I always just like to remind us that I get the spirit of it. The spirit is you're talking about confidentiality, but the ADA itself, saying it's HIPAA is really false, is incorrect. The ADA itself does not prohibit employers from directly contacting healthcare providers when medical information is needed to support a request for accommodation, right? This is, I know it's mincing words, but the HIPAA privacy rule restricts disclosure of that personally identifiable health information by healthcare providers. So it's the healthcare providers and insurers themselves that have to get the consent, right? And aren't allowed to disclose it. So I know at the end of the day, they still get the disclosure, I mean, the consent, but HIPAA does not apply to employers and, you know, are sharing information with employers, I guess, unless you're a healthcare provider. So just like to sort of remind us of that. Oh, thank you, Kathy. All right, so reasonable accommodation. I think we've kind of talked about this. I like to remind us that it's just a change into the way work is done, right? To enjoy equal employment opportunities and to allow people to enjoy the equal benefits and privileges of employment. And I'll discuss that more fully here. Think of accommodations as being in a few different categories. We'll start with this one. According to the EEOC, and I've said this today, there's 3 categories of accommodations. The first is changes to the job application process. Now, I think a lot of times it's easy to forget that maybe someone needs an interpreter during the job application or interview process. Maybe someone needs the material in an alternate format. Maybe instead of due to a disability, it has to be connected. Instead of an interview with 5 people barraging you with questions, maybe it's requesting the questions in advance to prepare related to your disability, or maybe it's a written, you know, something written instead of that. Anyway, accommodations during the application process. We also tell employers, if you want to recruit and hire people with disabilities, and you say you do, is your application process accessible? We often think about the second one, which is changes to the work environment or the way work is done, the essential functions of the job themselves. I'll go over some examples of that in a little bit here, but, you know, accommodations to help someone maybe do the job, perform the essential functions a little differently. And this is the spirit of the ADA one, helping people enjoy the equal benefits and privileges of employment. It's all those non-work benefits of work. Think about, you know, are your office parties that you hold at an accessible location where everyone can participate? Are they on the second floor where there's stairs and no elevator, where someone with a mobility challenge or using a wheelchair couldn't go? Are cafeterias accessible? Are employee lounges accessible? Is parking accessible? We get a lot of questions at the ADA Center about that. You know, it's those non-work benefits of work that help us feel included in our jobs, right? And there's an artichoke. That's a heart of the matter moment for me. Okay, so I think we're gonna take it home here pretty much with, I have just making sure, yeah, with a little piece here on what the ADA calls and talks about, called undue hardship and direct threat. So there's a couple exceptions to the employer's duty to accommodate, right? And let me go over them. One is what's called undue hardship. And I actually, you may not even have this in your PowerPoint, and I'm sorry, but I literally just pulled this out yesterday and thought it was important to share with you. Title I of the ADA requires an employer to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities who are employees or applicants for employment, unless to do so would cause undue hardship. So some examples of that, well, not examples yet. We always get a lot of questions about this. And so I'll talk a little bit about undue hardship. Think of undue hardship as kind of having two prongs. The first one I think we often think about that comes up is what's called significant, financial hardship or expense to the employer. And I'm going to tell you, I've gone to this National Employment Law Conference. I'm not a lawyer, but I've learned some things. And one thing I have learned is that, particularly for larger businesses like Cornell University, Best Buddies, Walmart, you name it, big companies, is that proving financial hardship is pretty hard because there's a really high burden of proof, and that's a quote. And because what will happen is, let's say that I request an accommodation at Cornell and my employer says, oh no, Jeffrey, that costs $500, that's too much. They wouldn't do that, but let's just pretend that happened. They're not just gonna, look at the one budget line for one piece of my work. We're on a lot of different projects and a lot of different budgets. They're gonna look at, the feds or whoever comes in to investigate this, all of the company resources. And it's pretty hard for large organizations to demonstrate excessive financial expense, right? And then the other one, and I have an example of this, is that reasonable accommodation must be provided unless, and another prong of undue hardship is that it causes significant difficulty. And so significant difficulty, and there's some specific language about this, and I'll give an example. Reasonable accommodations that are, this is a quote from the EOC, unduly extensive, substantial, or disruptive. Notice the language, it's extreme language, right? Or those that would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. So it can't just be, oh, this is going to hurt morale if you get a stool. That's not going to fly under undue hardship or significant difficulty. It has to be something that would dramatically impact the work. And here's my example, or actually, it's an EEOC example. Kim, you want to read this one? Or Kim?
Sure.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay, this is a significant difficulty example. A convenience store clerk with multiple sclerosis requests that he be allowed to go from working full-time to part-time as a reasonable accommodation because of his disability. The store assigns 2 clerks per shift, and if the first clerk's hours are reduced, the second clerk's workload will increase significantly beyond his ability to handle his responsibilities. The store determines that such an arrangement will result in inadequate coverage to serve customers in a timely manner, keep the shelves stocked, and maintain store security. Thus, the employer can show undue hardship based on the significant disruption to its operations, and therefore can refuse to reduce the employee's hours. The employer, however, would explore whether any other reasonable accommodation will assist the store clerk without causing undue hardship. Jeffrey, I think about like what situation your family's put in when, with the restaurant, same thing here with our family restaurant, like that would be a significant impact.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly, Kim and I talked, both of our families have restaurants, in the family. And so all of a sudden, if there were 2 people, it's a small place on shift and one person all of a sudden said they couldn't do certain hours, or it would make it a lot harder. They may or may not still accommodate, but it could be an example of significant difficulty. And notice the language here, right? Inadequate coverage to serve customers, which is an essential function. Keeping the shelves stocked, an essential function. Maintaining store security, I suppose that's an essential function, right? Disruption to operations, these are outlier examples, right? That have a higher burden of proof. All right, The other category, and there is a document, this is a hyperlink, enforcement guidance, and this example is enforcement guidance on disability-related inquiries and medical exams of employees under the ADA. That's an EEOC guidance, and there's another different guidance for undue hardship, but it's called direct threat. So the ADA talks about, or the EEOC, I think, specifically talks about direct threat. And it's the regulation states that a direct threat is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health and safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by accommodation. Notice with this example, the hardship example, you're not off the hook with looking for an accommodation. That is a part of the interactive process. So when an employer has, and this is the quote, I'm quoting here because I want to get it right, has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee's ability to perform the essential job functions will be impaired by a medical condition, or the employee will pose a direct threat to a medical condition because of a medical condition. Just to highlight here that direct threat also has to be applied to all applicants, you know, if people are applying for a job, or all employees, right? The same standard, just like we talked about before, and has to be a significant risk. It has to be specific and identified. It can't be speculative, right? Oh, someone they disclose they have bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder can't work here because haven't you seen on TV what happens when someone has a mental? I'm making that up, but it could be any disability because there's a lot of myths out there, right? And so it has to be very specific. I'm going to go, well, let's see. I'm thinking about, hold on a second here. I'm just going to look. Let's go to, I'm going to do one example here. All right, or maybe two examples. Tell me if you think this is a direct threat example. A welder has told her supervisor she has diabetes and needs to take breaks to manage the condition. The supervisor now wants to terminate the employee, fearing she might go into insulin shock while working with welding equipment, which could pose danger to coworkers. Does direct threat apply in this example or not? It's kind of is this a reasonable accommodation in this example, taking an extra break or whatever due to diabetes? What do you think? Can't give you as much time to think here because of our time here. So the correct response is that, yeah. Thank you, Kim. Yeah, no, the person could use a glucose monitor. Most people with diabetes, which is, by the way, a covered disability under the ADA often, effectively manage their condition effectively and don't experience insulin shock. So unless there's other evidence, if this employee were experiencing insulin shock on the job and could be of danger to themselves or others, that's another conversation, but we don't have enough information here. A truck driver comes into his dispatch office to be assigned another delivery. Their manager notices the driver seems to be staring a lot and walking very slowly. This is a credible direct threat situation. In this example, the manager could take immediate steps to alleviate the danger. Could be, even though this person hasn't disclosed anything, specifically, they could notify medical personnel, maybe not allow the employee to drive until they get further medical evidence to assess the danger. There's specific, I don't have to know why the bus driver is walking slowly or staring or whatever. I don't have to surmise, and probably shouldn't, that it's, oh, they're drunk, or, oh, they had a stroke, right? The reality is that it's focused on performance. It could put themselves and others in danger. So I'm just going to share with you, there is a great tool that we can share with you if we haven't already, There's a great tool that Jan, I love Job Accommodation Network. They have amazing resources when it comes to accommodations. And they have a document, and it's hyperlinked here, called the Interactive Process in Service Providers. And they talk you through the different steps that you can take as a service provider in supporting someone, from recognizing an accommodation request to implementing it to monitoring the request over time. So let's go to I'm gonna move past that one. Hold on a second, folks. I'm gonna share here. Basically, I just whizzed by a couple slides that show the 90s infomercial guy, Ron Popeil, who says set it and forget it. But I say set it and don't forget it. That sometimes we put accommodations in place, or they get put in place, and people forget about them, right? And it's important to monitor them over time to make sure they're effective. So I have some examples here of accommodations that are usually considered reasonable under the ADA. So things like making existing facilities accessible, job restructuring, changing job tasks, right? Not eliminating essential functions, accommodating essential functions. Maybe it's a part-time or modified work schedule or flexible scheduling, acquiring or modifying equipment, changing the format, the methods, the presentations of tests or training materials. Allowing a job coach at the work site is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. I actually wrote a fact sheet for the Northeast ADA Center. I can share it very quickly, very quickly. I also have it in Spanish if you want the Spanish version. There we go. I shared it. How quick was that? Usually, job coaches are often, and maybe even usually, considered accommodations that are reasonable. Employers get it wrong a lot. Just because the employer says they don't allow them doesn't mean it's permissible under the ADA. So the fact sheet goes a lot more into that topic. And these are some examples of not so much, right? Typically, these are not considered reasonable under the ADA. I started to say this before. The eliminating of essential job functions. An employer does not have to eliminate essential job functions. Remember, those are the fundamental duties of the position, the reason the job exists, right? And this is because a person with a disability who is unable to perform the essential functions, with or without accommodations, remember going back to the beginning, would not be qualified for that job under the ADA. Lowering production standards applied to all employees. Employers never have to lower their production standards as long as it's applied uniformly and fairly to all employees, right? Employers have to accommodate the individual, the person, in the accomplishing of their work tasks, but employers have a right to expect certain production of all employees. And I think this is one of those myths that's out there about people with disabilities in employment. Employers don't have to provide personal use items, right? So in other words, things that you would use in your personal life beyond work, hearing aids, my eyeglasses, communication devices that they would use outside of work, wheelchairs, etc. Do not have to provide those. Changing an employee's supervisor is, I won't get into all the case law on it, but has not been found to be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Now, the supervisor may have to change the way they communicate or change their supervision methods, and certainly the employee is protected from discrimination by, a bad supervisor, but the change doesn't have to happen per the ADA. And employers, just like our scenario before, employers never have to excuse a violation of uniformly applied conduct rules, right? Employer, and the key here is uniformly. The same rules, as I've said, need to be applied to everyone and not cherry-picked. Employers have every right. Maybe they can and maybe should have certain performance expectations in place for all employees. And it's also important to make sure that employees with disabilities, who sometimes can be not mentored as frequently as employees without disabilities, have the same level of training and mentoring as all employees. So I'm going to stop us there. You've all been great. I hope to see some of you next month. Wait, I forgot when our office hours are.
March 27th.
March 27th.
March 27th. If you have questions about or scenarios specific to what we talked about today, things you brought up in chat that you want to delve more into, that is a great day for that, but feel free to bring anything. I'll be there with a dean to just talk. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Lori. Thank you for the excellent training today. So good to see you all. I'll send out a follow-up email after probably by tomorrow with the recording as well. If some of you weren't able to attend this whole session, but we look forward to seeing you at the next jobs office hours. And everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
I'll stick around if anyone has any questions or wants to connect.
Thank you, everybody. A lot of information, I know. I appreciate you. All right, bye-bye.
Yeah, really good.